Welcome to this explainer. Today we're doing something really cool. We're going to dissect the foundational philosophy, the absolute bedrock of the Indian Constitution. We're looking way past the usual political talking points to examine the actual DNA of one of the world's largest democratic frameworks, straight from the source material. It's this fascinating mix of ancient philosophy and modern governance, and I can't wait to get into it. So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll be decoding Indian secularism. Then we'll look at the secularism debate, followed by the mechanics of democracy. After that, we'll cover the challenges to the system. And finally, the promises of the Preamble. Let's dive in. Section 1. Decoding Indian secularism. Okay, so at its most basic level, secularism just means the state doesn't have an official religion. But to really grasp the Indian context, we first need to anchor ourselves in the Western history of secularism. Over in Western Europe and the US, the whole concept relies on a really strict separation between state policy and religion. As former US President Thomas Jefferson famously put it, a wall of separation exists between the state and religion. Basically, the state just ignores religion entirely in its civic functioning. But check out how India dramatically contrasts with that Western idea. Indian secularism, it's a totally unique hybrid. It actually merges the Gandhian view of Sarva Dharma Sambhav, which roughly translates to the peaceful coexistence of all religions, with the Nehruvian view. Under Nehru's framework, the state doesn't just build a giant wall and ignore religion. Instead, it actively honors all faiths equally. It guarantees the freedom of religion, or even irreligion if you prefer, for absolutely everyone, while making sure no single faith becomes the official state religion. So it's really about equal recognition, not just equal distancing. Now, you might be wondering, how is this unique philosophy actually hardwired into the law? Well, it's definitely not just a theory. Look at these. Article 15 prohibits state discrimination based on religion. Article 16 guarantees equality of opportunity in public employment. Articles 25 through 28, those protect your fundamental right to freedom of religion. And then Articles 29 and 30 specifically protect minority cultural and educational rights. Finally, wrapping the whole shebang together is Article 326, universal adult suffrage, meaning every citizen gets a vote no matter their faith. These aren't just abstract ideas up in the clouds. They're the actual, literal constitutional shields protecting everyday life. Moving right along to Section 2, the secularism debate. Because let's be real, when complex philosophy meets the messy real world, you inevitably get some friction. Which brings us to a super pivotal question that scholars constantly ask. Is India a truly secular state? The debate here is actually so intense that some of the scholars in our source material go so far as to term India pseudo-secular. To understand why they make such a heavy claim, we have to impartially look at the historical events they're citing. Our notes highlight three main arguments from these scholars. First, the occurrence of communal violence at regular intervals. Second, the complex legislative aftereffects of the Shabano case regarding personal laws. And third, the demolition of the Babri Masjid. For these scholars, events like these suggest that the state has really struggled to maintain that perfect equilibrium of honoring all faiths equally. So, how on earth does the state navigate these incredible religious complexities? Well, mostly through the judiciary. And this brings us to something called the doctrine of essentiality. Formulated by the Supreme Court way back in the 1954 Sri Sri Sharurma case, the court basically assumed the massive responsibility of figuring out which customs and rituals are fundamental to a religion's core belief. Essentially, to protect religious freedom under Article 25, the court literally has to legally define what is and what isn't an essential part of a religion. It's a completely fascinating, albeit really complicated legal tightrope to walk. All right, let's shift gears. Section 3, the mechanics of democracy. Derived from the Greek words for people and rule, the democratic system really takes two primary forms globally. You've got direct democracy, which involves the direct participation of the people in everyday governance and lawmaking. And on the flip side, indirect democracy, which is rule through elected representatives. Now, given its absolute massive scale, India follows the indirect system, specifically utilizing what's called the first-past-the-post electoral system to choose its representatives. And this brilliantly highlights a major point about state capacity. Look at the tools of direct democracy used in places like Switzerland. They use initiative, where people can directly propose laws, referendum, where laws are sent straight to the public for a vote, recall, which is the power to literally unseat an elected official, and plebiscite, to get direct public opinion on major issues. But our sources are quick to point out that these direct tools just aren't feasible in India. The sheer scale of population diversity, mixed with varying levels of political awareness, makes rolling these devices out on a national scale practically impossible. That leads us right into Section 4, Challenges to the System. Because indirect democracy definitely has its own major hurdles. In fact, our notes contain this surprisingly cynical, kind of perverted twist on Abraham Lincoln's famous definition of democracy. Instead of the people, by the people, for the people, it reads, the gov is off the people, for the people, by the people. It's a really sharp, almost dark way to illustrate the modern, cynical view of elections when structural flaws start taking root. But what's actually driving all that cynicism? Well, the notes explicitly break down these systemic challenges. Let's look at how they kind of group together. Internally, there's a serious lack of core ideology among leaders, which leads to constant political defection. Plus, there's a lack of inter-party democracy, meaning candidates are often handpicked by high command rather than the grassroots voters. Then externally, you see the persistent, really divisive role of caste and religion being used to secure vote banks, alongside the overwhelming influence of money and criminals entering politics to essentially buy the elections. Ultimately, all of this leads to a massive decline in the quality of legislative debate. These are the real-world roadblocks complicating that perfect democratic ideal. Finally, Section 5, Promises of the Preamble. So, if the mechanics are flawed, and they clearly are, what keeps this massive engine running? We have to look to the preamble to synthesize the structural mechanics we've been discussing with the ultimate moral objectives of the state. First up, the preamble establishes India as a republic. This is an absolutely vital definition. It means that supreme power ultimately rests with elected individuals, not some royal bloodline. There's no hereditary monarch here. The head of state is chosen, directly reflecting the ultimate sovereignty of the everyday citizens. Next is the massive promise of justice. And notice how the Constitution's concept of justice is explicitly three-dimensional. It isn't just about courts and lawyers. It actually aims to uplift society on all fronts. Social justice, to remove societal barriers, economic justice, to tackle severe wealth disparity, and political justice, to make sure everyone has an equal voice. Then we have liberty. The Indian perspective on liberty is just incredibly nuanced. It recognizes negative liberty, which is the absence of restraints on thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship, but, and this is the kicker, it also requires the state to actively provide the conditions and opportunities for an individual to actually enjoy that freedom. In this specific constitutional philosophy, law and liberty aren't enemies. Without the law creating a safe environment, true liberty simply cannot exist. And of course, you cannot have liberty without equality. The preamble promises equality of status and opportunity. The absolute crucial takeaway here is that this requires the strict absence of privileges. The guarantee of your individual rights is completely meaningless if systemic, societal inequalities aren't actively being dismantled by the state. Finally, we get to fraternity. This is literally the glue holding this incredibly diverse nation together. It connects to the ancient Indian concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, or universal brotherhood. It's the constitutional recognition that despite differing religions, castes, or languages, citizens absolutely must view each other as children of the same soil. Because without ensuring individual dignity and fostering this deep feeling of fraternity, the unity and integrity of the whole country would just fracture. Which brings us to our conclusion. How on earth are all these grand promises actually protected from the whims of future politicians? Well, in the landmark Keshwanand Bardi case, the Supreme Court made a truly profound observation. They ruled that these very objectives, justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, secularism, and democracy, they all form a basic structure of the Constitution. And this basic structure is deemed so sacred it literally cannot be altered or destroyed, not even by an official amendment to the Constitution. It is the permanent, unchangeable DNA. But that leaves us with a totally fascinating paradox to consider. We've got a society facing incredibly modern challenges, from the overwhelming role of money power to deep-seated political cynicism. Yet its foundation is locked into this unalterable basic structure. So if the core philosophy cannot be altered, how will it successfully adapt to the unforeseen challenges of tomorrow's democracy? It's a question every focused learner of political systems really has to grapple with. Thanks for exploring this complex constitutional DNA with me in today's explainer. Let that question sit with you until next time.